Well, when I was a teenager, I remember one of my favorite shows that I really enjoyed watching week in and week out was a show called 24. Now, I've talked to some of you. I've known you long enough to know that many of you have enjoyed it too. But if you don't remember, 24 was a show that was on Fox, and it starred Kiefer Sutherland as Agent Jack Bauer. And he was the head or agent at some point of the CTU, which was the counter terrorist unit. And so, inevitably, he would have some great threat that he would have to intervene and disband, a threat against the state, threat against some particular city or politician or something like that. And every season would follow him around for a full calendar day, so for 24 hours. So in the series, or in the season rather, every episode would be 1 hour of real time. So as you followed his story, it took place in real time, counting the minutes and the seconds up to the hour. And so over the course of that one day, you'd see how much he was able to affect, how much he was able to change. But one of the things that is so memorable about the show is that invariably, right at the end of the episode, some big climactic and dramatic thing would happen, and then that famous countdown clock would start beeping, and you'd be left inevitably on a cliffhanger. So, episode after episode, you'd find yourself getting drawn in, excited about what you're seeing, and then a cliffhanger happened, and it was always the most frustrating thing in the world to see that countdown clock. But 24 didn't invent this device. In fact, it's been used for centuries. One of the famous uses of cliffhangers in Western literature has been with Charles Dickens. A lot of his novels were originally published in magazines or newspapers in a serial format. So at the end of the chapter, he'd leave something, a little thread for you to hold on to, and you'd have to wait for whatever next edition came out to continue on with the story. And so it seems like we have a long, healthy tradition of cliffhangers in our storytelling. And I think the reason why that is because that really draws us into a story. It invests us in the personality and of the characters and the quirks of the story. And so I think preaching through Jonah in some way is kind of an ideal book to go through portion by portion, because every passage that we end on is kind of its own cliffhanger in a way. And so we left off on a cliffhanger last week. It was discovered that Jonah was the quote unquote rat on the ship. He was the one that was the source of the problem. And the sailors asked about who he was, and he told them, and told them who his God was, how he made the land and the sea, and they were terrified. And so we left on that cliffhanger. And so now we're finally going to how they resolve the fact that Jonah is this scoundrel in their midst. But the sad thing is, we're going to leave on another cliffhanger, and we'll have to see what happens next week. So, to quote that famous old TV show that I'm sure many of you remember too, tune in next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Terrible joke. I'm sorry. You'll have to forgive me. But the cliffhanger that we left on is that Jonah has been revealed. He's been outed for who he is. A person that is either arrogant and prideful in his ethnicity and is condemning all these pagan sailors around him, or somebody that is just utterly just scapegoating his responsibility in the matter by pretending he's just a world-weary wanderer. But they figured out that Jonah is the problem. Now, the whole story up until this point is that God has called Jonah to rise up as a prophet and to go to Nineveh and to preach against its great evil, its great wickedness and injustice. And Jonah did rise up, but only to sink down, to descend down to a port city in Joppa, and then descend down into a ship and descend away, away, away from the presence of the Lord. So he enters this boat, he goes down to its lowest quarters, and he tries to hide from God. But the great irony, of course, is that he can't hide from him who made the seas upon which he now travels. So the winds and waters prevail on this little boat as a judgment for his disobedience. And he remains hidden away for a time until that is that he is pulled up by the captain and said, so, you were involved in some way. And when they cast lots and figure out that Jonah really is the problem, then they ask him a little bit more about who he is. And he tells them, of course, who he is and who he is that he worships. Now, the strange thing is that we talked about this last week. We don't really know for sure if he was the way he was talking to these sailors, if he was trying to brag about who he was to kind of get them off his back, or if he was being cowardly to try to conceal his details of his character. But regardless, it was revealed that he was the problem. And the surprising thing is these Gentile pagans that had no pre-existing knowledge of his God seem to be responding correctly. They're actually praying, they're repenting, they're trying to help one another out, even trying to help him. And so this brings great shame upon Jonah's name for his evil and for his apathy toward his fellow man. So everything in this story has been upside down. It's silly, it's topsy-turvy, it's outrageous. And all of this has called us to examine our own hearts as Christians when God tells us to go and love and serve our enemies and to pray for them that hurt us and persecute us. And it's not easy to do that, but we're called to do that. And so we see in Jonah somebody that's very relatable, somebody that's been given the mission of the message to go and preach the gospel, but doesn't want to do it for hatred of his enemy and love of his own comfort and convenience. But in verse 11 and 12, we see now, picking up in our passage for this evening, that after all this stuff, the panic and the fear is really setting in. It's really intensifying. And we read here in these verses that the sea grew more and more tempestuous. So after all this talking, after all this rambling, it still has not solved the problem. Things have still gotten really bad. You know, I think we've talked about this before, but the sea is a symbol in the ancient world of chaos and of evil and even of death. Because when you think about the sea, you see something that's vast and powerful, and a place in which you can't naturally abide. We can't float forever in a sea. And a place that's got many hidden creatures, and a place that's it's very moody. It can turn on a dime like that, and a storm can come upon you, and it can take your life away from you. So it's a perfect symbol of chaos and death. And so here this sea is all around them growing more and more chaotic. There needs to be an appeasement, it would seem. And so they ask one final question of Jonah. After asking about who he is and what he can do, they finally ask, "What shall we do to you, Jonah, that the sea may quiet down for us?" Now they know that he's connected in some way. And so these religious sailors, although they're pagans, they're religious people, they sense that some sort of sacrifice must be made. And Jonah's answer to them is kind of shocking. He says, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea." Now this is strange because Jonah seemed to be all about saving his own hide up until this point in the story. So we might ask, well, why in the world would he suddenly answer in a way that seems to be true and right? Well, I think there's maybe a couple things happening in his heart. First, I think that Jonah, even though he's been sleeping away and he's been trying to get away from his suffering shipmates and getting away from God's call to go and preach, I think he's now seeing the mess that he's made. I think he's seeing that the sea has grown greatly tempestuous. He's seen the worry in their face. He sees maybe some of them clutching on to their little useless wood and stone idols, and he probably sees the faces of not just men, but maybe some young boys who have wives and mothers and children and parents and whole families. And it's possible that maybe Jonah is feeling some tinge of guilt here. He knows that all of these people are suffering corporately because of his individual and private and personal sin. And so maybe in some sense, he is feeling remorseful, and he's willing to remedy their situation by being cast overboard into this very angry but righteous storm. So I think that maybe there's some of that going on. We don't really get that spelled out for us. But I have a sneaking suspicion, too, that maybe something a little bit more dastardly is happening. So the second thing that is happening, and probably this is more at play than that first thing, is that I think Jonah may just want to die so that he can finally, in his view, escape from the presence and the plans of the Lord. So I think he is willing to descend even further down into his sin to get away from what God has him to do. He's descended into Joppa, he's descended into this ship, and now he's ready to descend even into the underworld, what the Old Testament calls Sheol, so he can finally get away from the demands of a just and a merciful God. He can finally rest and be at peace, or so he thinks, from God. But Jonah, remember, folks, is a satire. Everything goes hilariously wrong for this wicked prophet. So he begins, or rather he begs them to throw him into the sea and to put him out of his misery. And maybe he is feeling a little sympathetic towards them too. And what do? They actually try to save his life. We read in these next verses, in verse 13, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to the dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. So this is incredible. Jonah is expecting these men to do what he would probably do in this situation and throw them overboard, and so he can finally be at peace. But that's not what they do. He can't even trust them to be selfish and reliable pagans. Even though he gives them a way out, what they actually try to do is to save his life. They try to work really hard so they can get back to shore and nobody has to perish. It's a surprisingly noble thing to do for, again, some very uncivilized pagan people. But then again, that goes to show you that this is a condemnation and a judgment on Jonah's heart. That even these people that he thinks are so wicked and so awful, there's something in them still that can respond to the goodness and the mercy of God, and they can likewise reflect that back to them, even if they're not faithful Jewish people like him. Well, I'm sure you've heard of the famous American pastor, theologian. His name was Jonathan Edwards. And, you know, he's kind of got a notorious reputation for one particular sermon. It was a sermon even I read when I was in an American literature class in a state college. It had no leaning towards a Christian understanding of literature. But we read in that class, and many people have read, a sermon from the late 1700s called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, this was a sermon that was so powerful, and it was delivered in such an interesting way that it began what many came to call the First Great Awakening in the United States, when people in the late 1700s were coming to faith in droves. There seemed to be a spirit of revival in America then. And Edwards was a rather brilliant man, and he was an incredible thinker and theologian, but you know, he was complicated and flawed too. And at one point in his ministry, he was ejected as the pastor of a church that he loved and shepherded for several years for some dispute. And although he was heartbroken, he continued on in his ministry, not with the Congregationalist people that he had been with for some time, but he decided that he would take his message to the local indigenous people, the local Native Americans. And he discovered kind of a shocking truth when he went and he met with these people and tried to share the gospel. He discovered that this tribe that he was ministering to, and in most cases, were more moral, were more just, were more upright and righteous than the professing believers in his old church. So here they were, a people that had no sort of Christian faith, but seemed to uphold to a sort of Christian ethic and value system better than some of the Christians he knew. So this led Edwards to begin studying world religions to try to make sense of this experience that he had. And what he found in some cases, like with many Chinese folk religions is that sometimes non-Christian people could seemingly act more ethical, more morally than even Orthodox, believing, professing Christians. Now, why do I say all this? Well, for the simple reason that I think as Christians, we need to be humble in our walk with the Lord and remember that God is a God of common grace, that He allows for people of every stripe and people of every place and tongue and identity to contribute things to the world that seemingly are good and helpful things. That's why you don't need to be a devout Christian to be a brilliant scientist or doctor or artist or politician or worker in any way. That you can contribute to the common good and yet not know Christ at all. And so I think we're seeing that here in this passage. We're seeing that these are a bunch of sinners, and yet they seem to be rebuking the righteous people because they're acting more in line with the way that God reveals Himself in Scripture than to people, to religious people that ought to know better. As we've been studying Mark on Sunday mornings, we've seen this all over the place. Some of the Gentiles, some of the people on the outskirts of society, some of the people that are in less than desirable positions and less than desirable careers seem to be acting with more moral authority than even the Pharisees and the Sadducees, people whose business it is to be religious. And so I think this is something not only for Jonah to think about, but for us to think about too, and showing grace and mercy to people that are different from us, reminding ourselves that although they may not worship Christ, and we hope for them to do that because there's no greater thing than to be a Christian and to follow after Jesus and to be loved by Him, we need to remind ourselves that they were made in His image and the wonderful things they do reflect His goodness, even in an imperfect and flawed way. So that's what I think we can make of these pagans acting righteously. But nevertheless, the storm is still not relenting. Even though they were being gracious to Jonah and trying to get him out of a mess, it still was not enough. Now, I think this is a good reminder to us that although we try to do good things in the world and be good people, that ultimately no human action or human repentance is ultimately good enough to atone for the sin in our life and the sin in the world. We need an external source of atonement for that reason. Nothing Jonah did, nothing these sailors did could satisfy the just wrath of God against His vileness and rebellion and wickedness. So what did they do? When all of their actions, with all of their final attempts to save themselves, what did they end up doing? Well, they did the thing that really was the thing that they could have done from the very beginning. They turned to the Lord in faith and called out to Him by name. And in verse 14, we read what they said. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. And so here we see, in other words, these men are praying. But they're not asking, notice, their own personal gods. They're not asking the gods of their families or their professions or their regions or their religions. They are calling out to Jonah's God. And not only are they calling out to Jonah's God generically, they are calling out to Him by name. They are using the word Yahweh. They are calling out to the God that made the dry land and the vast sea. They're calling out to Him by name. And they pray to Him that He might receive a sacrifice so that they might be forgiven and that His power would be revealed in their midst. It's a pretty good prayer, I think, and one that's maybe not bad for us to model our own prayer life after. But we read this in verse 15. So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now this is, again, a wild scene. This is such a strange book, because if you can imagine this scene, here they are in the terrible mess they're in. They're terrified. They've exhausted all of their human resources. and they're now praying to a God that they've never heard about before, maybe just 5, 10 minutes ago. And now they throw Jonah into the sea, what he suggested that they would do, as a kind of sacrifice, as a kind of appeasement. And the second he's swallowed up by the water, we read that the sea ceased from its raging. Now, what do you think you might feel in that situation? If you were in a terrible, life-threatening storm, and you knew it was somebody's fault, and they went into the ocean, and all of a sudden the waters just stilled, and all that wind just died down, and it was a peaceful day all of a sudden. I think you'd feel a sense of relief, maybe a sense of terror, amazement, probably all those things. And I think it would be enough to lead most people to convert on the spot. And I think that's what's happening here, because they feared the Lord. They saw that all the gods they'd been praying to, nothing was working. But this God that Jonah believed in was so just, was so merciful, that even one of his own worshipers going into the ocean meant the deliverance of these men. And so we read that they offered a sacrifice and they made vows of faithfulness unto the Lord. And so these unknown men, I believe, in my heart of hearts, became brothers in the faith. And so a strange occurrence happens here when they see the power of God in the world, even when it's justice against his own sinful people. They came to understand something about God's grace and his mercy towards others. But let's look at our final verse here, the most famous verse, and probably what we've all been waiting to get to. Maybe one of the famous verses in the Old Testament, I would imagine. But we read in verse 17 that the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, in her novel, Christ the Lord, Out of Egypt as the subtitle, an author named Anne Rice writes about the imagined childhood of Jesus. So she is pretty thorough in her research and investigation of what might be like to live in that day, but she gives us kind of a fictional account of what it might be like to watch Jesus grow up from afar. And in one of the scenes, one of Jesus' uncles is telling both him and his cousins the story of Jonah. And the delightful thing about their reaction is that these children are doubled over with laughter, especially when they get to this verse about Jonah being swallowed by a giant fish. And as church people that have been in church for a long, long time and have heard this story many, many times, I wonder if it would still be possible for us to do the same, to really laugh, to think humorously about this, to laugh at a man who is so terribly rebellious to God and yet completely incapable of escaping God's goodness, to really laugh at ourselves when we think about how in times past we've maybe tried to escape God's will for us and found ourselves running smack dab into the center of God's will instead. And maybe we can even laugh, and not in an irreverent or crass way, but laugh with a sense of joy and relief and pure elation, knowing that when Jonah, when he is plunged into the sea and gobbled up like worm food, that this is pointing to the most miraculous thing that's ever happened on earth for our sake. It points us directly to not Jonah's story, not anything about him, but it points us instead to the very sign that Jesus himself uses to point to what he will do to save us. Because here in Jonah 1:17, we see not only the sign of Jonah, but we see the sign of the cross. We see ultimately what Jesus will do and what he will accomplish for us. Now, again, in the ancient world, the sea is a terrifying symbol of chaos and of evil and death. And a giant fish swimming around in that chaos and that evil and that death, to some of the more sophisticated Old Testament readers of Jonah's day, they might have connected this sea monster, this giant fish, to the Leviathan that we read about in the book of Job, who's this kind of unidentified chaos monster that lives in the sea, who's completely untamable by man. But we read that he's totally subservient to the Lord. The Lord can put this monster that swallows men up whole, he can put him on a leash and keep him like a little pet. And so people in Israel might have associated this great fish, this great sea monster, with the idea of the serpent in the garden, with the enemy of humanity. And so Jonah, being hurled into the depths of the sea and being swallowed by a leviathan-like fish, all of that would spell out nothing but death for Jonah. So if you were really reading this in this kind of truncated way that we've been going through the story of Jonah, where we'll get to kind of a cliffhanger and leave off there, if you're reading this and never heard this story before, you might think that this really is the end for Jonah, because not only is he gone into the ocean where death lives, but a monster that rules in death, it's associated with Satan and is got characteristics that are similar to the serpent in the garden, has swallowed him alive. That means he's a goner. He's been gotten by the devil in the realm of death. That's what it seems like to these people. But God in his wisdom shows that this tragedy is actually a comedy. It's something that we're meant to truly, truly find joy and laughter in, because Jonah miraculously doesn't perish in this fish, but he rises out of it as a changed man. And so in Matthew 12, Jesus' religious enemies, the Pharisees, who knew this story very well, came to challenge Jesus by asking him to perform signs and wonders to show himself for who he really was. And he rebuked their demands because their hearts were hidden from God, just like Jonah's was. And Jesus told them that they would receive no sign, they would receive no demon banishing, no food providing, no wine making, no body healing, no dead raising sign, nothing better than the sign that he would give the whole world one day, when Jesus, like Jonah, would be swallowed up by death, and yet 3 days later come out of it totally unscathed. Jesus, like Jonah, would go into the realm of death. He would go into the chaotic waters of death. More than that, he would even go into the belly of this great fish, this great serpent, before rising to crush its head. And that Jesus, like Jonah, on the third day would rise anew to commission his people to continue on preaching the gospel wherever they may go. Now, don't miss one word in verse 17 here. There's a couple key words that we've seen are, this is a great fish. It's big like the city of Nineveh. It's big like the sin of Jonah. But an important word that happens also later in the book, in chapter 4, that we'll get to eventually, is that we read that the Lord appointed this fish. So in God's love and grace, he providentially appointed that Jesus would face the death of crucifixion like Jonah faced the deadly ocean. And God's providential wisdom, he appointed that Jesus would harrow the serpent's hell just like Jonah entered the fish's belly. And in God's grace and providence, he appointed that Jesus would also rise from death on the third day, just like Jonah would emerge from this fish 3 days later. God appointed this all, not only for the love of a wicked Nineveh, but for the love of a wicked world, for the love of wicked people like you and like me, that we might also be redeemed and set free forever. Now Jonah, we'll find out, will go into Nineveh still. He'll go reluctantly. But Jesus sends his spirit-empowered body, namely us, the church, to go into the world and to preach the good news that the God-man himself dies, is buried, and rises again for sinners just like you and just like me. And the reality is that he loves you. He loves us. Not as we will be one day, not when we're perfect, not when we're got it all together, but he loves us like he even loves Jonah when we're at our worst, when we're misbehaving the most, when we're the most rebellious, when we're like Nineveh, when we're even violent and wicked and evil, he still loves us. And in all our suffering, in all our struggling, in all our sickness, and in all our sin, he loves us and died for us and raised us and now has ascended for us. He's done that not only for us, but he's done that for you, the individual that's watching and thinking about this right now. So, my suggestion to you, the bit of wisdom I have to share is don't be like these Pharisees in Matthew 12. Don't be a person that's looking only for signs and wonders, miraculous things, trying to read the newspaper and interpret, what the end is going to be. Don't be that kind of person. Don't put your trust in religion or politics or business or family or even yourself, because the only sign you're ever going to need, the only wonder that you're ever really going to need is this. It's the sign of Jonah, that God in Christ, that God in Jesus lives, dies, and lives again so that you might do the same, no matter who you are or no matter what your background may be, where you come from, all your faults and failures. This message is for you. So let's pray with a dismissal prayer. Father, help us to look for no other sign but the sign that we do indeed find in the sea, the sign of Jonah, which points us to Jesus in a manger, Jesus on a cross, Jesus in a tomb, and Jesus arisen and ascended to the throne. And help us to follow him and him alone. For it's in his name that we now ask and pray all these things. Amen.